So good afternoon. Believe me, I do not want to stop anyone from eating lunch, so please, lunch is very important to me. I made sure to get it out of the way before I came up here, so please keep going. So, who am I? Mark Shelburne. I'm a housing policy consultant. I actually lived in Raleigh since the late 90s and have been a housing policy consultant for just about that whole time. I mostly work with state housing finance agencies around the country. Currently, like for example, Hawaii is one of my clients, advising them on their QAP. But I spent most of my career with the state housing finance agency here in North Carolina, including working with EMLA, we were just talking about. And so, but the other role that I have that's almost more relevant for today is I'm adjunct faculty at the UNC Chapel Hill Department of City and Regional Planning. That's kind of what I feel like I'm doing here today, is giving a lecture to the students, except of course y'all aren't students, but that's kind of what we're doing today here, is giving these lectures. And a lot of what I'm going to do is reinforce things that you've already heard to help them sink in and to explain them a little bit further. And maybe a few truth to power moments here, we'll see. So got an outline slide here, make sure this is working. Very good, yep. So just a quick refresher on what is affordable housing. It's not as obvious as you might think. So what does it take to create it? What does it take to finance it? And then we've got 6 key takeaways. And so, and I see some folks taking pictures of this. I believe the materials are going to be available later. So if you wanted to have this information, you're welcome to take pictures, but you don't have to necessarily. You can get this information another way. So, what is affordable housing? So, as we've discussed already today, housing is considered affordable if it's no more than 30% of the household's gross income. And when we say 30%, that's not just the rent or mortgage, that's utility costs as well. And so that's the idea, is it's affordable if your maximum housing costs are 30% of your household income. And so that's what it means literally in a very basic sense. So, but when most people talk about, policymakers, et cetera, and folks like myself lecturing, talk about affordable housing, what they mean is housing that meets that 30% threshold for low-income households. That's generally what folks are talking about, the presumption being that if you're not low income, then you should be able to afford your housing. Although, of course, as some of y'all know, that's not necessarily true. And so creating affordable housing requires and involves all manner of steps and processes, some of the most important of which are deed restrictions, legal requirements that maintain a certain level of affordability for a particular property, and keeps it limited to folks that are at lower incomes. And one way to think about those restrictions, the way that I like to describe it, and this is true for almost any kind of affordable housing, but it's especially true for the main one I'm going to talk about here, the tax credit, is most restrictions fall into 3 categories: income of the household, rent they're charged, and suitability of the units. So income, rent, suitability, IRS. That's what most of the types of property restrictions fall under. So, continuing on, did I skip a slide? Make sure. Okay, hold on a second. I want to be sure. Okay, hopefully I didn't skip a slide here. All right, so the way that almost every housing program defines what it's serving, who are the low-income households, is by area median income. And we've had some folks make this point before about lining up the households. You pick someone in the middle. And so the way that I like to explain it, though, is for at least a while there, if you were to do the average income of the highest average income amongst UNC graduates, you were to say, well, okay, what type of degree had the highest average income? You would think, well, business, something like that. Well, for a while there, it was geography. Anybody know why? Michael Jordan, his degree was in geography. So the highest average income amongst UNC graduates for a while there was geography because Michael Jordan makes so much money. But if you were to look at the highest median income, I'm pretty sure geography would not be in the top 10. I don't know for certain of that, but that'd be my guess. So average and median are not the same. And so what we're talking about here with everything we're looking at today is median. You line everybody up and you pick the middle, regardless of how the extremes on either end of it. So, like, in other words, if Bill Gates were to move to Raleigh, it wouldn't change the median income at all. Change the average a lot, of course. And so we've got here in this color, the boxes down below, and I think I have a laser pointer here. Let me see. Ah, very good. Yes. All right. So these are the folks, middle and upper income, 80% AMI. They're really not eligible for anything. Well, except for what? Anybody remember? The home mortgage interest deduction, the biggest subsidy that if you're rich, you get automatically. That's how it works if you're rich. If you're poor, you got to go through all these steps. But if you're rich, you get the mortgage interest deduction automatically. Yeah, that's a bigger subject that we're not going to get into. So, but that is a subsidy. Everyone needs to understand. So, but the main subsidies we're talking about here are for these different levels here. So, low income, 50 and 80%. That's the 80% limit is actually what most programs will serve up to. And so, like home, for example, that's a federal appropriation to the city. And a lot of the uses of home, you can get up to 80%. For tax credits, you actually also can get up to 80%. But most of the units, though, that get produced and generated and served are at this middle level here, very low income, 30% to 50% AMI. And that's also the definition. Now, of course, most of the need is down here at the extremely low income level. So that's, and you saw in the video the different types of programs that serve those different AMI levels, because it takes different degrees of intervention, different kinds of programs to reach those different income levels. And as you might imagine, the lower the income level, the more subsidy you need to make the unit work. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here coming up. So, we're going to talk today about affordable housing programs, and I'm glad to get to do that. That's been my life's work. Spent more than 20 years, again, in affordable rental subsidy policy. But you can't talk about affordable housing affordability without also talking about the market. You have to talk about both. And so the key to understanding housing affordability at a broader level is supply and demand. And it's the same supply and demand that makes cars more or less expensive. Anybody remember during the pandemic when you had a used car that you'd owned for a few months, you could sell it for more than you bought it for? Because the demand exceeded supply. And there's a lot of people who will try to come up with all sorts of crazy reasons why supply and demand doesn't apply to housing. They're wrong. Supply and demand applies to housing. That's just the reality of it. It can be inconvenient at times, but markets don't care about inconvenience. They don't care about ideology. Supply and demand applies to housing. And so the ways that are different, though, is the ways that it moves. And so demand can increase rapidly. Like, for example, Apple says they're going to move here. All of a sudden, you got however many thousands of people that are looking at listings in Raleigh because they're going to come work for Apple. But you can't build housing at that same rate. It takes longer for the supply to catch up to the demand. So the way that it works is different. The reality of it applying is not different. And so what then happens is if you don't allow supply to keep up with demand, then you have the problems that Greg was talking about with the musical chairs. And so whoever's the fastest and the best able to sit at the musical chairs gets to take the seat. And so, and this bottom point here about low-income households, even if we did as much as we possibly could as a community to generate more subsidy, it'd be good and better. But still, most of the folks who are at these lower income levels are still going to be living in market rate housing. That's just the reality of it. And so folks that are at that level, they need help from these subsidy programs, but they also need help from allowing the market to respond to demand. And something that folks don't necessarily understand about market rate housing when it gets built, a developer doesn't just go out and find a site and think, oh, what the heck, I'll just build here, that'll be fun, and go out to the banks, and the banks say, oh, sure, we'll trust you, take the money, go for it. That's not how it works. And that might seem obvious, but the way folks talk about housing reflects they don't necessarily understand that. In order to get the ability to build housing, you have to prove to your lenders, to your equity investors, and whoever else that the demand is there. You don't get to just build it on spec. That's not how housing works. There are people that actually do that analysis. I've got coworkers in my firm who do that analysis to make sure that the demand is there. So again, we can't talk about housing affordability without talking about both the market and the subsidy programs. So, moving on. A lot of this is reiterating what you heard from Greg this morning, which was just great. Everybody needs to hear that all over again. I can't do that justice. But the facts of supply and demand affecting housing means that it trickles into affecting homelessness. And so one way to think about that, one way to look at that, the way that it gets demonstrated and the way that's best understood is looking at vacancy rates. And so, and those are a lot easier to understand. And that's what people that are landlords and land sellers care about, home sellers, well, there's really just landlords, care about is vacancy rates. And so if you're in an area that consistently underproduces the housing, then you're going to have really low vacancy rates. And as Greg said, you really need vacancy rates to be above 5%. If they're below 5%, then you've got a problem. That's an unhealthy market. That's problematic. And what you see in those circumstances where you've got that going on, where it's less than 5%, that's where homelessness is the worst. Again, I can't do justice to Greg's remarks, but hopefully all of you were here to hear that explanation of how that is. And what you see there is that as vacancy rates go down, landlords understand they can charge more rents. And as rents go up, homelessness does as well. And there's a direct, not just correlation, but causation here. And so another way to think about this, and it sounds strange, is the notion is that vacancies are good. Well, unless you're a landlord. But if you care about the health of a market, vacancies are good. So anytime you hear someone say, one way to tell that someone's not serious in a discussion, you just kind of tune them out, is if they say, oh, we have more vacancies than we have homeless people. Anybody heard that? Well, hopefully, yeah, I'm seeing some people shake their heads. Good, maybe you're in better discourses than I'm in. But you hear that sometimes. And usually what they're trying to say is we don't need to build more housing. We just, because we got all this vacant housing, just let the homeless people live there. Well, there's no way for that to happen. And it also misunderstands what is a vacancy. A lot of times that unit that's vacant is just in between occupants. The person that moved out has moved out and someone else hadn't moved in yet. Or the unit is completely uninhabitable. It counts as a unit except for the fact that you couldn't really live there because it doesn't work. So you can't just presume that a vacancy is an available unit because it isn't. But again, regardless, if there's no vacancy, how could anybody move? How could anyone change their circumstance? Vacancy is good. And so, yeah, moving on. So that's, again, just talking about the connection between housing affordability and the market. There's more we could talk about there, but what we want to focus on here is the subsidy programs. And so what does it take to create them? So what we've got here is a graphic depiction. And what this is depicting, what this is explaining, so again, as I said, we've got to think about the market, but the other thing that we've got to understand is that as important as the market is, it's never enough. And that's something that you have to and that's because that's the other kind of argument you hear from people. You hear people say, "Oh, if we just get rid of all zoning, just let people build anything they want anywhere, then housing affordability will be solved." Well, no, it would be better. It would be a lot better, but it wouldn't be solved. And that's the lesson that even if, I'm going to show you some numbers here, but even if you're not a numbers person, even if you're a history person, let's take a trip back to the 1910s, 1900s, 1890s. Zoning didn't exist. We didn't have it. And did everyone get to live in adequate housing back then? Anyone remember tenements? So that is what the market does. The market's response to the lowest income is substandard housing. And that's not just true in America. That's true all over the world. And I don't know why that is. I'm nowhere near smart enough to understand or explain it. But that is the absolute, indisputable lesson of history. And is that whenever the market alone is serving the lowest income, it does it with substandard structures. So again, that's something that we've just got to accept. So if we as a society decide that that's not enough, that's not okay, then we need to have intervention in what I call, and what a lot of people call, market failure. And so how does that work? Well, what again we've got here is this graphic depiction of it. And so what this is depicting and explaining is, when I teach this to grad students, what I emphasize to them is that what we're talking about here, even though it's subsidized, it's still real estate. It's got to work and function as real estate. It doesn't matter how much subsidy you have in it, if it doesn't function as a real estate development, as the way that any real estate does, then it doesn't work. So the most important bottom line is the bottom line. It's got to be able to pay for itself, because if it doesn't, then you've got a whole other set of problems. And so what we see here is that subsidies are necessary to make these developments pay for themselves. And so again, these boxes are really well done, but they're not exactly necessarily to scale. And so what you've got here is, this is the debt that a project is bringing on, and then this is the operating expenses. And so it's got to pay all this much, and it's got this debt because of having taken on these costs. But the gap it's created is, this is the only amount of rent that it can have. So this gap here is graphically depicting the reality that when you build households for folks that are below a certain level of AMI, you can't generate enough rent. And so to make it work, make sure how I'm doing on time here. Oh, I'm doing all right. All right, so now we talk about this in generalities, and it's necessary to do that in the time we have available. But it's important to remember that what we're talking about here is a great deal of variety. Developments are tremendously different depending on how they're constructed, what they're designed. So one of the most inexpensive kind, say for example, is an 8-plex, 8 units together built on flat land somewhere. And so, but you can't always do that. Sometimes you got to do other types of designs. And so the way that you build the housing, all sorts of factors can go into it, make the cost that can be very different. But as a general rule, the idea that we've got here, and these are some good numbers, is that an affordable apartment can cost, on average, roughly $250,000 to $300,000 per unit. And so again, we've got some factors in there that can make it cost more, like having to build parking decks, et cetera. And some of you may be thinking, well, that's a lot more than I would have thought. That's a lot more than it should be. I can build a single family house for a lot less than that. And then maybe that's true. But it really is an apples to oranges comparison. Market rate, unsubsidized housing is, despite physically looking the same, it's a different type of development than what we're talking about here with the subsidies. And time permitting, I can explain the reasons why that is. That's not the point of today. But you have to understand, when people say, oh, look at how expensive it is to build this affordable apartment. Well, yeah, it is. But there are good reasons why you can't compare that to building a market rate project. And I will say one thing that, well, I can't help myself. One thing that when people make that comparison, when they talk about the cost of the market rate of the affordable, they'll say, look, it costs us $300,000, whereas the market rate property costs, say, $200,000. Often the comparisons themselves are not apples and oranges. With the affordable one, you know all the information, you've got all the numbers because it's all publicly available. With the market rate one, you don't have all the information. So you're ignoring certain costs. So really, it costs a lot more than you think it does. You just don't know what those costs are. So, at any rate, sorry, I'm on my little soapbox moments there. I couldn't resist. And so the question is then, how do you get to where you can build this affordable project? What does it take to make it happen? Well, again, you've got to be able to show that your rental revenue from it is enough to cover what are going to be the building operations and loan payments, and for some types of properties, investor returns. And so we've got here is that a household at 60% AMI can support $125,000 in debt. And so that whole concept there is really no different than any of you who have gone out to apply for a mortgage to buy a house. The bank does the exact same thing. They look, I'll never forget when I first went to get a mortgage myself in 1999, it was for a house in Oakwood. I was amazed at how much the bank was willing to lend me. Of course, we later learned maybe that wasn't so smart for them to have been so willing. But it's that same concept, is the bank wants to be able to be certain, whether it's giving you a mortgage loan to an individual or a property, they want to be certain they're going to get repaid. And so what they look at is, can your rent that you're going to generate cover, how much can it cover in debt? And what we've got here again is this rough estimate of $125,000 per unit. And that, again, that number is a point in time estimate. If interest rates were to spike, that number would go way down. If interest rates were to drop, that number would go way up. If insurance costs continue to go up, that number goes down. You can see what I'm getting at there. And so the bottom line of it, again, the bottom line, is that we've got a gap just initially starting out the door, out the gate, of $100,000 to build these properties. If you want to build one of these properties for households at 60% AMI, you're missing $100,000. And so you've got to come up with that somehow. So how does that work? And so it's different with affordable programs than it is for market programs. And so what with a market rate project, you're going to look at that, you're going to say, well, can I generate enough income so it covers the $200,000-$300,000? And what a lot of people don't understand and don't get is how often developers look at a circumstance and they realize it doesn't work. Because why would they announce to the world, yes, I found a site, consider making an offer, but I couldn't make the numbers work, so I'm going to walk away. That happens every day. But you just don't hear about it, because why would you? But it does. It happens, again, every day. And so that's the reality for market rate projects. But with affordable developments, they look at it and they think, well, how much subsidy can I get to make up this gap? And so that's where the role of government is to step in, federal, state, and local. And in some cases, philanthropy. That's a much more limited role, but philanthropy can have a role in helping to bridge this gap. So, see if I moved on. Yep. So, and one of the best things that can happen, since we're talking at the local level, at this local level, is to help fill that gap. And so the biggest thing that we have in our country, the program that I spent most of my career working on, is called the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. And so I reckon some of y'all have heard about it, maybe not. And the reason you haven't heard much about it is because it works really well. It's very successful. It doesn't make the news with scandals. And so it's been around since 1986. It's funded about 3 million, probably getting up close to 4 million units all over the country. In North Carolina, we're probably getting up to around 100,000 units around the state. And I just about guarantee that at some point last week, one of y'all drove past one of these properties. At some point, well, unless you're like me and you never go anywhere, you just stay at home all day, because I work from home. But if you have a normal life and actually go out and do things, you probably have driven past one of these properties at some point, but you didn't know it because it looks just like a regular market rate property. But they're out there. Again, there's thousands of them all over the state. And so What the problem, though, is that while that subsidy is good and helps, it doesn't do enough. And so what local governments can do is add to that, provide additional subsidies called a gap fill, a further gap fill. And so that's what the city and the county here, Raleigh and Wake, have done, is provide a lot of their money to make those properties viable that otherwise wouldn't be. And so, and what that's called, as some of you may have heard, is called leveraging. The idea being that you invest, you make a loan of X dollars to generate Y dollars worth of housing. So maybe you put in $50,000, $75,000 per unit of your local money, and then that produces an affordable apartment, which we've just talked about costs how much? $300,000. So you spend $50,000, $75,000 per unit. That sounds like a lot, but you're producing a $300,000 property, $300,000 per unit property. So again, you're leveraging that difference, and you can't beat that. That's as good a way, in my opinion. And granted, I'm biased because I'm in this program, but there's no other way to spend that little money to get that big of an outcome, because the federal government is paying for the difference. They're paying for the rest. Again, we'll look more about that here in just a second. And so, and the part of the reason why the housing credit, what we're supposed to call it, the low-income housing tax credit, but the propaganda name is housing credit, so that's why I try to remember to always use, is that it doesn't cover everything. And the big thing it doesn't cover is land. And so the way the housing credit gets calculated, it's on bricks and sticks and moving dirt around and actually building things. But whatever you spend just to buy the land doesn't generate subsidy in this low-income housing tax credit program. So whatever you spend, whatever the land cost is, has to be effectively covered by debt. And so one of the great things that some local governments have been able to do, including sometimes here in Raleigh, is you have land and you just give it away for free to build these properties. That's tremendous, because that means that what would have been otherwise a big gap is much less of one, because the land is free. But there's not only so much free land sitting around. Most land you got to actually pay for, reasonably so. And so however much you spend on it is how much you got to add to the gap for that project. And so that's where a lot of this local government financing can come in to help bridge this gap. And, oh wait, sorry, I thought I advanced the slide. There you go. That's what I've just been talking about. So I'll give you a second to look at that. There's not one of those little screens down here in front so I can see what y'all are seeing. And I feel kind of rude always just turning my head to look to see, but I should have then. Sorry about that. Yeah, so anyway, land is a problem. Land costs are a problem. But the other thing about that, though, is just because land is cheap doesn't mean it's a good place to build. In fact, you could very convincingly argue that the opposite is true, that you don't want to build where the land is cheap. Because while it's good for the numbers, it's probably not so good to live there. And so you want to have folks that are living in these properties get to live in nice locations, which means the land is not going to be cheap, and so you got to spend a little more on it. And that's especially true when you're talking about urban infill areas where you're next to transit, where you're reasonable distance to grocery stores. All those things tend to make land more expensive, which again can be a real problem. And so the one way to help deal with that reality is the land costs what it costs, but you can put more units on it. And so the more units you put on it, the more you spread that cost out, is the concept. So that's why building dense, building a lot of units on a particular piece of property can help make it more viable, because you're spreading that land cost out. And so, and so one way to do that is, and by the way, I've done I guess I should have done that run through a little better. I'm running out, I'm going to have plenty of time here for questions. And so one way to help make that happen is to take a tax credit project and put it on the same piece of land as a market rate project. And so you have both of them together sharing that cost of land. And as I understand it, that's the concept for the Moore Square Place proposal, which is genius. That's exactly the right way to go. That's absolutely what needs to happen. And so because you can have the two different developments both covering what's going to be an expensive piece of land. And so what some of you may be thinking is, well, why don't you have them be the same property? Why don't you have the tax credit project have in it some market rate units? And that's a very common thought. A lot of people think it, but because of the way the federal rules work, that's actually a problem. You can do it, but it's often a bad idea. It's usually almost always better to have the property that is the tax credit property be 100% low income. And the big reason is because Congress didn't want to spend money on unrestricted units. And so however many unrestricted units you have in a property is that much less of the subsidy you can get. So it makes it that much harder to finance, make it that much harder to work. And so so the better approach is the idea of having them share a piece of land, two different properties. They can have cross-access easement, they can share amenities, they can share parking lots, all that kind of stuff if you want. But they have different ownership, different financing structure is the most logical way to do it. And I've got on there one of the reasons why, if you really wanted to dig deep in the weeds of what I'm just talking about, if you disagree or think I must be wrong, well, read those things at that URL and to get more of an understanding about this and how that can make sense. And so, but there's another concept that you're going to hear about this afternoon from my friend Sherry, which is very exciting, is what they're doing in Montgomery County, which doesn't use subsidy, well, the same way at least. Anyway, I won't steal her thunder. But she's going to talk about that in the innovations panel. And that's a whole other concept that I'm excited about as a possible prospect for the city. And so, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions here again, because I thought I guess I went faster than I thought. Sorry about that. And so, but we can focus on here now are these key takeaways. Again, the affordable housing means that the household spends no more than 30% of their income on mortgage, rent, utilities, maintenance costs, et cetera. That's a generally applicable concept. It is not just true for low-income folks, it's true across the board. That's the fundamental concept behind housing affordability. And so the other next key takeaway here is that while we're talking about subsidies and they're necessary and important, you always have to remember the market matters too. So the second key takeaway here, another way to phrase it is anyone who's saying, oh, we don't need more housing, we just need more affordable housing. That's wrong. We need all kinds of housing. And again, a developer is not going to build it unless they can prove there's a need for it to third parties through experts. So if someone has figured that out, if someone has brought to you a proposal saying, we've got this project, we've figured out how it works, they know that it's going to work because that's what has to happen. You're not going to be able to get financing for it if you can't make it work. And so if the folks who would have lived in that property don't get to live there, if they're rich, they're going to get to live somewhere else. And the best way to understand that, people talk about supply and demand, it's true, but the actual technical term is called filtering. And some people say, oh, that's trickle down. No, it's not trickle down. That's a Reaganomics nonsense. Sorry. The concept is filtering, and filtering can be up or down. And so if you've got a bad problem, it filters in the wrong direction. That's what's happened. People have been talking about San Francisco and the Bay Area. What happened out there is for every housing unit they allowed to get built, they brought in 4 jobs. So think about that. 4 jobs, each of which itself is one household, but there's only one household getting built. So that means there's 3 households for each of those jobs for which there's no house getting built. And again, these are new jobs, created jobs, because of the whole tech boom they had out there. So people blame the techies, and I kind of get that, but it's not really, they just moved to where their job was. The job got created. The city, and it's not just San Francisco, a lot of jurisdictions out there, didn't allow the market to respond. And so as a result, they have the worst affordability and the worst homelessness. Well, depending on how you define it. But it's because of that 4-to-1 ratio. And so you don't even want to be close to a 4-to-1 ratio, because the closer you are to that kind of ratio, the worse you're going to have. And it also affects displacement too. There was some statistic that talked about how if you wanted to get a moving van to California, it was pretty cheap. If you want to get a moving van out of California, it was really expensive. And that's because those folks that were that were not in that one of the three of the four that got a home, someone else bid them out of their place. Someone else was willing to pay more, so they had to leave. And so that's what happened. That's why folks that are low income get displaced, is because we don't allow the market to respond. And so, but again, the market isn't enough. It never has been, it never will be. We need subsidies. They're absolutely imperative for serving the lowest income households, because if we don't have that, the only way they're going to get served is substandard structures, overcrowding, et cetera. And so we need to have gap funding, because what it costs to build is twice what they can afford to pay effectively. And so a great way to make that work and happen is to bring in the federal low-income housing tax credit, because that's out there. The federal credit is going to get spent somewhere in the state. The state gets $30 million a year. It's actually $300 million a year when you really think about it correctly. It's getting $300 million a year that's going to be spent somewhere in the state. And that's just one of the kinds of credits. There's a whole other kind of credit that can be that same amount or more. And it's going to be somewhere. And so the city putting in money to get those federal dollars to be here is a tremendous return on investment. Again, leverage. But the way that works is you got to have a good enough, big enough piece of land for it to work. And I guess something else that I should mention is that for these types of projects to get built, they have to be a certain size, because whenever you're doing one of these deals, you're hiring attorneys and accountants. And the attorneys and accountants get paid the same amount no matter how big the deal is, because they do the same amount of work no matter how big the deal is. And so you can't have small projects, because if you're spending $200,000, $300,000 per deal on your attorneys and your accountants, then if you're building a couple of units, that just doesn't work. You can't spread that cost out far enough. So the projects have got to be usually about at least 30 or so units, and that's on the really small end. For the most part, they're 50, 60, or well over 100 units. And so, but that means you got to find enough land to fit all those folks on there. And so, and when the land gets to be too expensive, then as we discussed, sometimes the answer is the developer walks away and you never even know about it. But if they're trying to go forward with it, they want the deal to work, then they're going to have to do more creative approaches, like combining different developments on the same property, having a market rate and a tax credit project together, which is going to mean some kind of stacked parking, probably, some other, maybe underground stormwater retainage, that kind of thing. Anything like that is going to make it that much more expensive, but it can be worth it to pay for expensive land. And so again, hopefully everyone will stick around for the far more interesting than me part of this afternoon. I'm just, I guess, meant to wake you up from lunch. I don't know that I did that. But the innovations panel will be great, especially Sherry, again. I guess you probably don't want me building you up any more than I have. Yeah, I see head shaking, but seriously, stick around to hear about the Montgomery County model, because it really is a very innovative, neat concept that I think could have a lot of promise for Raleigh. So, all right, well, got 10 minutes left. That's about right for questions. So I don't know, Erica, if we have any.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That was a really great 201 explanation. And I realized earlier today I failed to introduce myself. Hello, I'm Erica Brandt. I'm the Assistant Director with the Housing and Neighborhoods Department. I'm the ghost voice who is asking your excellent questions that you're submitting through the QR code link. So to start us off for this session, I think this is a great question. And kind of dives maybe a little bit deeper. Maybe that's like a 301 level question. But Mark, could you tell us a little bit about the difference between the 4% and the 9% tax credit?
Sure thing. And by the way, thumbs up on the QR code question thing. That's definitely the way to go. So recommend that. Yes. So there are two different kinds of tax credits: 9% and 4%. And so the 9% is the one people mainly think about, and it actually is 9%. The idea is you multiply that number times most of the kinds of costs of the property, and that's how much subsidy the development generates every year for 10 years. And so again, I'm really summarizing. But what Congress said was, if you want to use this program, the tax credit program, with tax-exempt debt, then you don't get to use the 9% credit. That's too much subsidy. That's double dipping. So instead, if you're going to use debt that already is tax advantaged, then all you can have is the 4% credit. And so the idea being there that you get some, but not as much. Is that means if you're using tax exempt debt, you get some benefit, some years none, but in terms of a lower interest rate, it's supposed to be a lower interest rate, but whoever's getting the interest on that doesn't pay taxes on it. And so that's supposed to be a lower interest rate. So the idea being that you get a tax credit, but it's less of one. And so that's the fundamental concept there. And so because the 9% is such a powerful incentive, what that means is there's a tremendous amount of competition to get it. Actually, Winston-Salem this year had the worst competition that I think any state has ever had. It had 7 applications for what I thought was going to be just one award. It turned out they somehow squeaked out a second one, but still, there was 2 awards for what were 7 applications in Winston-Salem. Raleigh wasn't anywhere near that bad this year. I don't know what was going on in Winston-Salem. But that's the most, but it's not ridiculous and unusual. Usually it's about 3 to 1, whereas with bond deals, where you're only getting the 4% credit, the struggle is not to compete to win a competition, it's to make your numbers work. Because instead of getting the 9% multiplied by the costs, you're getting only 4%. So that means you generate less than half the amount of subsidy. And so your deal needs that much more gap filling from local governments.
Thank you. What do you see as the most significant barriers for developers in utilizing the low-income housing tax credit effectively?
Well, it's really those two things. The 9% credit gets utilized completely. None of it ever goes to waste. And so the real barriers there are what drive up the costs, in some cases unnecessarily. And so the main one that I hear about is after you get an award, because in order to get your 9%, you have to have worked out the zoning. And that can be its own pain in the neck. But once you get the award, then you've got to get all your permits, approvals, et cetera. And the longer those take, the more expensive it is and the more risky it is. And so that's one of the big challenges that these developers face is they get an award, woohoo, yay, I'm going to get to build a project. But then the building inspector says, yeah, I'll get to you in a few months. Well, no, that's not, I need it now. And in addition to being more expensive, there are some federal deadlines that if you don't meet, it kills your project. And there's no waiver, there's no exemption. Use the example of Star Wars, Yoda. There's do or you don't do, there's no try. And so for some of those deadlines, if you don't meet them, that's it. Or you could think about it as the end of Thelma and Louise. If you don't meet them, it's like, sorry, spoiler alert. But if you haven't seen Thelma and Louise, that's on you. You need to see it. And so the biggest challenge with 4% deals, because they're not competitive, is 4% deals have that same issue. Once they get an award, they got to get all their approvals. But for them, the hardest thing, though, is getting the zoning, because the fact that they can't get the zoning means they don't bring in the deal at all. And again, they'll look at a piece of property, they'll see, oh, this is zoned single family, those neighbors are going to complain, and so the deal never happens. And for the most part, again, you don't even hear about it. It's just units that don't get built because they know the zoning isn't there. Whereas if it was zoned, they'd build it, and you have the units.
What else could the city do to generate more affordable rental developments?
Well, I feel like I've kind of already answered the questions that are being asked. Maybe that's just my own mind, it's connected to what I just said, is to change its land use requirements to make it so that building apartments was by right, or at least a lot easier, more often. And so, because right now the state does not use all of the 4% credit that it can. You could have more projects getting built. But I can tell you, developers, they'll go and they'll find real estate, and they know it can work, they can bring it together, but they know if they try to fight the neighbors, they'll lose. And so they just walk away. And again, you don't hear about that, but just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so that's probably the thing that's most in your control Because you could change that tomorrow at the next council meeting. You know, I know I'm being really blunt here, but that's just how it is. Now, the other thing you can do, of course, is invest more gap subsidy, because the more gap subsidy you have, the more the deals that will work. And so you really need both. But I know it's harder to ask someone to write a check than it is just to change your rules. Well, I say harder. Of course, you'll make homeowners mad, but I don't care about that. And so, yeah, anyway, that may not be the official formal answer, but that's what I think.
Thank you. Do low-income housing tax credit properties directly serve people with disabilities?
Yes, absolutely. And so that's something, since we're talking about homelessness here, that's an important thing to know, is that through work, again, that I did with Emila back when we were at the Housing Finance Agency, is every property that we're talking about here that has 9 or 4% credits sets aside 10% of its units for persons with disabilities that get referred from the local service providers. And the folks that are on, for the most part, are on disability income SSI, they can't even afford the 60% rents, maybe not even 30% rents. And so what the state does is it writes a check for the difference. So folks that have that disability level income, they pay what they can afford, but then the state comes in and covers, and that's called the KEY program, and it covers the difference. So that's because again, the bottom line is the bottom line. The owners have to be able to afford to operate their property. And so folks that are on SSI income, they don't make enough money to even pay what they can afford to pay. Isn't even enough to cover the operating expenses, what it costs to mow the lawn and to fix the drywall. And so you need to have that gap. And so the state kicks in with that. And in some circumstances, there's federal, like Section 8 or USDA rural development. Some of those properties have that resource, which is even better when that works. But yes, every one of these properties, 10% of the units is available to referrals from the community, the service providers. And who they refer is up to them. That's not the owner has no say in that. They've had no role in that. It's none of their business, because they're the landlord. That's all they are, is the landlord. So the person that gets referred to them, that's between them and their referral source.
As the LIHTC program evolves, what potential changes or improvements do you think could enhance the impact that it has on affordable housing development?
What physical changes?
What policy changes?
Oh, policy changes. Well, I mean, I can't help but say the big obvious one is that there be more of it. There was, some of y'all have heard about how the child tax credit legislation passed the House back in April. I think it was April, anyway, it seems like forever ago, and just recently failed in the Senate. And along with that legislation was legislation to dramatically improve the housing credit, including a substantial increase in the 9%. And it was also going to make bond deals easier to use. And it's really remarkable that the House, they didn't just vote for it. It was something like 330 out of the 400, what is it? I should know, 435 House members. I'm seeing your heads nodding. Thankfully I remembered that. 330 of them voted. I mean, how many things do 330 members of the House of Representatives agree on? But they agreed on this legislation. And granted, it did a lot more than just the low-income housing tax credit. It did the child tax credit and other stuff. And that went over to the Senate, where sadly, again, it died. But that'd be the biggest thing for that legislation to not die and actually get passed. But the key thing about, the other key thing about this program is that while it's federal, the federal guidelines for how to administer it are tiny. There's an IRS regulation, and it talks about, say, one of the things it talks about is the selection criteria that states use in the competition that I mentioned. So the entirety of that federal regulation describing the selection criteria is the word in brackets reserved. That's it. The entire process of the selection criteria, other than there's a few things in the statute, but states get to decide how it works. And so here, that's the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, and every year they actively reach out. They sent out an email to everyone on their list last week saying, give me your input. We want the input from you on how to make our rules better, how to improve them. And I know that because that was my job. I got those emails, and the staff takes them seriously and takes into account, they think about. And one of the things that's coming up, I know a lot recently, is the notion of how many parking spots get required, because the state has required more parking spaces than some localities think is necessary. So that's just one example, but there's dozens of possible examples of how things can be better. Because the agency wants that input from its stakeholders, participants, to know how to do those things and do them better.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think that's all
Oh, yeah.
we have time for today, but we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.